Will used a lighter to burn an important mathematical answer. The professor immediately rushed forward as if by instinct. He tried to put out the fire with trembling hands. His eyes were filled with panic and despair. Seeing the professor's miserable state made Will briefly hesitate in his heart. Although he was a born genius, Will could still feel confusion at that moment. To him, that mathematical problem was as simple as a basic addition. But for the professor, this was the pinnacle he had spent his entire life chasing, yet could never reach. The professor felt deep regret when seeing a young person like Will wasting his God-given talent. But he didn't know that every action Will took had its own reason. Before meeting the professor, every morning, Will waited for his friend to pick him up. They went together to a construction site to perform manual labor. Their job was to carry heavy bricks all day long. When night fell, Will put on a janitor's uniform and went to work at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. One day, while cleaning a lecture hall, Will accidentally noticed a strange math problem on the blackboard. It took him only a few short minutes to easily solve it. What Will didn't realize was that this was an extremely advanced Fourier transform problem, a problem so difficult that only a handful of people in the world could solve it. Initially, the professor thought it was just someone's prank, but upon carefully reading the solution, he was immediately stunned. It was an absolutely perfect answer. Right at the world's most prestigious university, a real genius had just emerged. Earlier, the professor had announced to the class, anyone who solved the problem on the board before the semester ended would immediately receive full marks. That person would also be permanently recorded in MIT's history. But what the professor never expected was that just one day after he issued the challenge, the problem was already solved. The next day, the mathematics classroom was packed with students. Everyone was curious to know who the anonymous genius was. The professor asked that person to step forward from the crowd, but the entire class remained silent. No one dared to claim credit for solving that problem. Reluctantly, the professor decided to write another problem on the board. It was an extremely complicated problem, which had taken him and his colleagues 2 full years to solve. At this moment, Will was in another part of the city. He had just seen someone who bullied him in kindergarten. Without a second thought, Will jumped out of the car with his best friend and began beating him up. The opponent quickly fell to the ground, but Will still refused to stop. A patrol officer noticed the incident and immediately ran over to intervene. In his moment of rage, Will instinctively kicked the policeman. Will was arrested and taken to the police station shortly afterward. Though eventually released, he was still charged with assaulting an officer. Will had to appear in court within a few days, but he didn't seem overly worried. To him, this was nothing new. That evening, when he returned to the lecture hall to continue cleaning, Will saw the new math problem the professor had written on the board. Without any hesitation, he immediately began solving it. While he was absorbed in writing down the solution, the professor happened to walk by. Seeing someone in a janitor's clothes writing on the blackboard, he mistakenly thought it was an act of vandalism. The professor quickly rushed over, intending to stop him, but Will quickly slipped away. He chased him down the corridor but lost sight of him at the end. Returning to the classroom and closely examining the solution on the board, he stood frozen. The solution the janitor left behind was completely accurate. The professor instantly understood everything. He had just missed the anonymous genius he'd been looking for all this time. Fearing that he'd be discovered, Will decided to quit his job the very next day. He returned to his aimless daily life, wandering around with his close group of friends. All 4 of them had no clear direction in life. Their eyes always revealed vague uncertainty about the future. The next day, the professor followed clues to find MIT's janitorial department. From there, he obtained Will's contact information. Right at that moment, Will had to appear in court for assaulting the officer. He didn't hire a lawyer because he already memorized the entire U.S. Constitution. With sharp arguments, Will silenced both the prosecution and the judge. He referenced clearly each famous case from the past to defend himself. Obviously, this wasn't the first time he'd stood in front of a judge. The professor watched the trial from the back of the courtroom. His eyes clearly showed admiration. But this time, Will wasn't as fortunate as before. The judge spent considerable time reviewing Will's criminal records: fighting, theft, vandalism, impersonating a police officer, and assault. Strangely, all previous charges had ended in acquittal. However, this time the court decided Will must be detained. Bail was set at $50,000 with no right to appeal. If no one came forward to help Will, he would have to spend his youth behind bars. At that moment, the professor stepped forward, agreeing to bail Will out. But he had two non-negotiable conditions. First, every week Will must spend time solving math problems with him. Second, Will must participate in regular psychological counseling sessions.
Although he deeply despised psychology, Will still accepted these terms. Compared to jail, sitting and talking with a doctor was much more comfortable. Indeed, Will did not disappoint the professor. No matter how complex the math problem was, Will only needed a few seconds to find the optimal solution. The professor was completely satisfied with Will's mathematical abilities, but the psychological counseling turned out to be an endless headache for him. During their very first session, as soon as the psychologist began speaking, Will interrupted with cutting remarks. By listening to his speech and looking into his eyes, Will immediately identified the psychologist's sexual orientation. It turned out he'd secretly read the doctor's personal files beforehand. With just a few words, Will enraged the psychologist enough to make him walk out immediately. After that, the professor replaced 4 other psychologists, but all of them were also provoked by Will to the point they could no longer endure. Each declared they would never treat him again. Out of options, the professor sought help from an old friend. That person was Sean, a psychology lecturer who'd studied alongside him in college. At first, Sean had no intention of accepting Will as a patient. Despite the professor repeatedly emphasizing Will's rare talent, Sean coldly declined. Only when the professor reminded him that they'd grown up in the same hometown, sharing similar childhood experiences, did Sean pause. After a long moment of silence, he finally nodded in agreement. On their first day meeting Sean, Will arrived with a clearly defiant attitude. He ignored the 3 people waiting and silently sat down in the only chair in the room. Before Sean could say a word, Will glanced mockingly around the office. He started talking about irrelevant topics, deliberately evading Sean's questions. Looking at the bookshelves, Will sneered and declared all those books were trash. Sean heard it clearly, but remained calm. No anger, no reaction at all. Seeing this, Will pushed further, uttering sharp and bitter insults. He bluntly declared everything Sean was attempting to do was meaningless. Sean maintained his peaceful demeanor and humbly asked Will where he was mistaken. Will continued provoking by mentioning Sean's late wife. He claimed Sean had married the wrong woman. That sentence touched Sean's ultimate limit. Sensing he'd found Sean's weakness, Will continued hurling insults about Sean's wife. But this time, Sean quickly stood up, approached Will, and firmly grabbed him by the throat. The sudden move completely stunned and frightened Will. This was the first time a psychologist didn't run away from his provocation, but responded decisively instead. Will believed he'd won again. He assumed Sean would give up like all the others before him. But to his surprise, Sean returned the following week. He arrived on time, quietly sitting in his usual chair, waiting patiently for Will. Will was right about one thing. Sean was like a man rowing a small boat amidst a violent storm. Even though the wind was strong enough to break the oars, Sean continued rowing, as if searching for a peaceful harbor to anchor his soul. One Thursday afternoon, Will went to his therapy session as usual, but this time, Sean wasn't waiting inside the office. Instead, Sean invited him outside. The two sat down together on a bench by the river. Around them, the breeze was gentle and the water flowed quietly. Will maintained his usual mocking attitude, but this time, Sean's words penetrated deep into his heart. Sean began by saying Will was just a kid who spoke very well. When discussing art, Will could easily cite theories from books, but he'd never truly experienced the scent of an ancient cathedral. When talking about women, he could list countless peculiarities, but he'd never known the happiness of waking up next to someone he truly loved. Discussing war, he could recite Shakespeare's poems by heart, but he'd never watched a friend die before his eyes. Nor had he ever experienced the extreme pain of losing someone he deeply cherished. Sean continued by saying he'd read hundreds of books about orphans, but that didn't give him the right to judge Will's life. Unless Will genuinely opened up, no one could ever truly understand who he was. For the first time in his life, Will felt someone looking straight into his soul. Yet he wasn't ready to surrender. The following therapy sessions passed in total silence. Will didn't speak, nor did Sean. They sat silently like two shadows until their time was up. Then came a day Will couldn't hold back any longer. He began by telling a short joke. Sean only smiled slightly, but Will hadn't intended to tell a joke at all. He was merely trying to break the thick ice between them. It turned out A few weeks earlier, Will had met Skylar at a bar near Harvard University. That evening, a friend of Will's pretended to be a history student to impress a girl. Unfortunately, he met an actual history student who quickly exposed him, leaving everyone feeling awkward. Will observed the scene from afar, then decided to step in. Calmly, he repeated everything his friend had just said. He even listed the subject, textbook, research topic, and thesis and page numbers of the referenced quotes. Everyone in the bar was stunned by Will's extraordinary memory and knowledge. Embarrassed, the actual student sarcastically mocked Will as merely a nobody street kid. Will refused to back down and bluntly told him if he had a problem, they could settle it outside. The student quickly retreated, feeling humiliated. Before leaving, Skylar approached Will and gently said something that completely surprised him. She told him that she'd been waiting 45 minutes for him to approach her, but he hadn't done anything. Then she handed Will her phone number in front of everyone's astonished eyes. Since that fateful encounter, Will and Skylar started dating. For the first time in his life, Will felt cared for and loved by someone else. But wanting to maintain his perfect image in Skylar's eyes, he didn't dare take too much initiative. One night, he called Skylar during a heavy rainstorm, but said nothing. He just silently held the phone, then hung up.
After hearing this story, Sean immediately recognized Will's issue. He said Will entirely lacked genuine emotional experiences. Will's effort to preserve a perfect image in Skylar's eyes was actually a defense mechanism. Will was afraid if anyone saw his true self, they'd immediately leave him. He always feared abandonment, just like all previous times in his life. Sean explained this was typical behavior for children who've experienced trauma. By preventing anyone from entering their lives, they avoid disappointment, but it also meant they'd never truly experience fulfillment. To illustrate this point, Sean shared a personal story. Whenever Sean's wife felt stressed, she often farted in her sleep. Once the noise was so loud it startled their dog in the yard. Sean woke up, but the next morning she jokingly blamed him instead. They laughed together, filling their home with warmth. Sean knew every minor flaw his wife had, and she also knew his imperfections. Neither needed the other to be perfect. What mattered was mutual understanding and acceptance. According to Sean, that was the most valuable thing in a relationship. Not perfection, but absolute sincerity. After hearing this, Will asked Sean whether he'd ever considered remarrying after losing his wife. Sean didn't answer. Will immediately turned the tables using Sean's own words against him. Will said if Sean had chosen to live a closed-off life like himself, perhaps life would have been much easier for Sean. The two stared silently at each other for a moment. Finally, Sean gently said, their time was up. Will was startled, realizing it was the first time he'd lost track of time during therapy. Since that special session, Will started changing. One day, he proactively went to find Skylar at her school. Skylar told him she couldn't meet because she had assignments to finish. Not wanting to wait, Will promptly completed all her assignments himself, then brought them to her. This gesture deeply moved Skylar. From then on, the two became closer than ever. Skylar gradually became a source of light in Will's dark life. One day, Skylar curiously asked Will about his family. To hide his true background, Will fabricated a story claiming he had 12 siblings. Excited, Skylar wanted to meet them all. Will felt extremely awkward, unsure how to respond. He could only reluctantly agree and avoid future encounters. In the next therapy session, Will asked Sean a question that stunned him. He asked what Sean's life would have been like if he'd never met his wife. Sean didn't avoid the question. Instead, he chose to answer it from another angle. Sean told Will about a legendary baseball game on the day he'd first met his wife. It was a historic game every man wanted to watch live at the stadium. But that day, Sean chose not to go. Instead, he spent the evening with the woman who later became his wife. Sean said he'd never regretted that decision. He also never regretted abandoning work to care for his wife during her final years battling a terminal illness. He never regretted giving all his love and time to the person he cherished most. Will sat quietly, absorbing Sean's words. He saw before him a man who had everything and then lost it all. Yet Sean never used loss as an excuse to retreat. Instead, he turned his pain into a reason to love even more deeply. That sincerity made Will genuinely respect Sean for the first time and brought them closer together than ever before. At this point, Will had a stable job at MIT. Complex mathematical problems became child's play in his hands. The professor was very pleased seeing Will's abilities. He approached Sean to discuss Will's future. Numerous prestigious institutions awaited a rare talent like Will. The professor wanted Will to quickly reach his full potential, but Sean disagreed. According to Sean, Will wasn't ready yet. But the professor was impatient. He wanted Will to quickly achieve greatness. He wanted the world to know Will's name. Ignoring Sean's objections, the professor arranged an important interview for Will. But on the appointment day, it wasn't Will who showed up. It was his best friend. Meanwhile, Will was spending time happily with Skylar. Skylar repeatedly mentioned wanting to meet Will's siblings, but he constantly avoided the subject. Will feared she'd discover his shabby house, feared she'd realize he was a poor orphan. Will was afraid of losing the only person he'd ever allowed into his life. Despite his intelligence, Will couldn't escape deep-seated insecurity. Even a casual joke from Skylar made him tense and anxious. He started imagining a painful future, a future where Skylar married a successful man. Late at night, they'd lie beside each other and mock Will. This thought suffocated him. One day, Skylar suggested Will move with her to California, where she'd soon study medicine. He immediately refused. Will feared change. Since childhood, he'd grown accustomed to abandonment and constant relocation. In his mind, leaving familiar surroundings always meant disaster. But what terrified him most was if they spent enough time together, Skylar would eventually see his inner wounds clearly. Then, inevitably, she'd abandon him just like everyone else. Unable to express these fears, Will's rejection appeared arrogant to Skylar. She couldn't see behind his silence was a deeply wounded soul. Skylar began believing Will resented her wealthy background. Yet she herself had lost both parents at 13. Every morning, she would have gladly traded all her wealth just for one more day with her family. The only difference between Skylar and Will was she bravely faced her past, while Will chose to run. Skylar admitted she'd been dishonest with Will. After saying this, she burst into tears. They argued bitterly. Finally, Will coldly turned and walked away. Skylar was heartbroken when Will said he didn't love her. The next morning, the professor sensed something odd seeing the new solution Will had completed. Will coldly remarked it was correct. Learning Will skipped the interview, the professor's anger exploded. He thought of everything he'd done for Will, yet Will showed no gratitude. Will refused to back down. He bluntly declared solving math problems was child's play for him. He didn't need guidance or anyone's favors. Finishing his speech, Will used a lighter to burn the solution, throwing it down dismissively. The professor rushed forward, trying desperately to extinguish the flames. But what hurt him most wasn't Will's attitude, it was seeing him destroying the precious gift God gave him. From that moment, their relationship was irreparably damaged. In the next therapy session, Sean asked Will a simple question that deeply stung him. Did he have anyone he considered a soulmate? Will immediately avoided answering by mentioning long-dead historical figures. Sean quickly realized the problem. Will genuinely had no one like that in his life. Sean pressed Will to be honest with himself. He said he knew Will didn't come to MIT just to clean chalkboards. He came seeking something greater. But when asked what he truly wanted, Will again avoided answering. He casually remarked that he just wanted to be a shepherd. Sean stood up without saying another word. Quietly, he opened the door, indicating it was time for Will to leave. Will was stunned, not understanding what had just happened. He didn't realize Sean had grown exhausted by his constant evasiveness. Like with Skylar, Will never allowed anyone to see his true self. Before Skylar left town, Will called her one last time. Skylar still told him she loved him. Hearing that, Will felt truly happy. But all he managed to say was "take care," before quietly hanging up. Until the very last moment, Will still couldn't overcome his inner fear.
Skylar couldn't understand Will's strange behavior. She left carrying only disappointment and heartbreak. Afterward, everything returned to the starting point. Will once again retreated into his familiar protective shell. He comforted himself that living this way forever wasn't so bad. At least nobody else could hurt him again. When Will's best friend discovered he'd missed the crucial interview and lost the love of his life, he said something that forced Will to seriously reconsider everything. His friend said if 20 years later he still saw Will joining him at the construction site, he'd beat Will up himself, because Will held a winning lottery ticket but lacked the courage to cash it.
He continued saying, "Every day I pick you up, we drink beer, wander around, and do stupid things. Those are genuinely joyful moments. But for me, the best moment each day is when I park in front of your house. During the 10 seconds it takes to walk from the car to your door, I always hope that day you finally left. I don't need a goodbye. I just want to know you've truly gone to live the life you've always desired." Will stood silently, unable to respond. He felt everything inside him turning upside down. At that moment, Will understood their friendship had no strings attached. It was simply wishing him freedom. When the professor discovered Sean had dismissed Will mid-session, he became shocked and angry. For the professor, this action meant Will would return to his aimless old life, wasting his exceptional talent. But Sean understood Will better than anyone. He knew Will would willingly abandon everything to keep his 3 closest friends. To Will, they represented the only valuable relationship he'd ever had. Since birth, the first thing Will experienced was abandonment. The person supposed to love him most chose to discard him instead. Thus, whenever someone approached, Will would instinctively push them away first. It was his way of protecting himself from pain. Consequently, he'd lived in loneliness for 20 years. Sean understood this better than anyone else. He knew further pressure would only make Will retreat deeper. But the professor disagreed. He couldn't accept such remarkable talent being buried senselessly. One person didn't want Will wasting his intellectual gift. The other didn't want Will losing himself. 2 longtime friends fiercely argued because of Will. Right at the debate's climax, Will quietly entered the room. He stood silently, looking at them. Realizing Will's presence, the professor stopped speaking. Without another word, he stood up and left. Only Sean and Will remained in the room. Sean was holding Will's personal file. Inside were old photos and documents detailing past abuse in foster homes. These were wounds Will had hidden deeply for 20 years. Sean didn't ask any questions. He patiently waited. For the first time, Will began sharing painful memories he'd never revealed to anyone before. Unjustified beatings, long nights filled with fear, the constant feeling of abandonment. Sean gently approached, looked directly into Will's eyes, and softly said, "This wasn't your fault." Will laughed bitterly, as if Sean had said something funny. He told Sean to stop joking. But Sean persisted, repeating gently again and again, "This wasn't your fault." Each time Sean spoke, Will grew more agitated, repeatedly telling Sean to stop. But Sean continued, patiently and gently. By the 11th repetition, Will completely broke down. He started sobbing uncontrollably. Tears he'd buried for 20 years finally flowed freely. Will collapsed onto Sean's shoulder. For the first time in his life, he allowed someone to see his vulnerability. Sean said nothing further. He just quietly held Will. It was the first embrace Will didn't resist. After that extraordinary therapy session, Will's life entered a new chapter. For the first time, he stopped running or avoiding. He spent an entire night carefully reflecting on everything. Eventually, he decided to accept the job offer the professor had arranged earlier. Will proactively attended the interview as a regular candidate, no longer defiant or defensive. Now, Will genuinely wanted to try living differently. The therapy sessions were also nearing an end. Will began feeling a sense of loss whenever he thought about the day he'd have to say goodbye to Sean. One day, Will cautiously asked Sean if they could keep in touch after therapy ended. Sean gladly agreed, but mentioned he'd soon be traveling for a while. He wanted to visit places he'd never been. He wished to gamble once more with his life, to recapture feelings he'd had in the past. He called this the second spring of his life, a remaining chapter he refused to spend regretting. In that moment, they looked at each other as genuine friends, no longer separated by the roles of doctor and patient. No barrier existed between a teacher and his rebellious student. At this moment, they'd completed their journey of healing one another. Coincidentally, that same day was Will's 21st birthday. His closest friends had secretly saved money to buy him a special gift. It was an old, ugly-looking car, but it had a powerful 6-cylinder engine. They laughed and joked together as always. None of them knew everything would completely change the very next morning. The next day, Will's best friend arrived to pick him up, as usual. He called repeatedly, but got no response. Approaching the window, he peered inside. The familiar room had been completely cleared out. No sign remained indicating Will was still there. Only then did his friend realize Will had finally left. He stood silently for a long moment, then suddenly laughed softly. No sadness or disappointment appeared. Instead, deep joy quietly surged within him, because Will had finally found the courage to escape the invisible cage that trapped him for 20 years. Will had truly decided to seek his own worth in life. Elsewhere, Sean was packing his luggage, preparing for his new journey. At that exact moment, Will drove the old car his friends had gifted him to Sean's house. Sitting quietly in the car, he gazed at the small home that had helped him rediscover himself. Deep emotions filled Will's heart. But he didn't enter the house. Instead, Will silently placed a letter into Sean's mailbox before driving away. Sean stepped outside, noticing the mailbox was slightly open. He took the letter in his hands and opened it. In the letter, Will wrote only a few simple lines. He asked Sean to apologize to the professor on his behalf since he had decided to temporarily set aside the job arranged by him. Will added if Sean once gave up watching a significant baseball game to be with the woman he loved, he also didn't want to live a life he'd later regret. Will now clearly understood what he truly desired. Leaving everything behind, he went searching for the most precious thing he had lost, Skylar's love.